I'm going to be talking about China again. I seem to do a lot of that these days. Um, and obviously, for a number of reasons, China is a very important topic in relation to the question of climate change and conserving the environment and saving the planet. Um, I mean, it's very fashionable these days to essentially, according to a Western narrative, essentially blame China for the climate crisis, and you'll hear a lot of that around COP29 at the moment, um, as particularly the Western countries aim to shift responsibility away from themselves and towards China, which, as of the last few years, is the largest absolute emitter of greenhouse gases. It still burns a lot of coal, etc. Um, one obvious thing to bring up in relation to China being the largest emitter of greenhouse gases is, of course, China is a very big country with a population of 1.4 billion. If you look on a per capita basis, China's emissions are actually pretty normal, like pretty close to the global average, similar to, say, Bulgaria. They're half of those of the United States or of Canada. Um, and also, like, that's their current level of emissions. And this idea of current emissions level, emissions last year or over the last few years, sort of distorts the picture because carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases hang around in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So it's not really just about what this or that country did last year. It's about what these countries have been doing since, for the last 200-300 years since the start of the industrial period. In terms of cumulative emissions, like the quantity of excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today, the US itself is responsible for a full 25%, even though the US constitutes just 4% of the world's population. China's responsible for 13% of cumulative emissions, in spite of the fact that it's got 18% of the world's population. So if you look at that on a per capita basis, who's responsible for more of the cumulative emissions in the atmosphere, then the US is responsible for 8 times as much as China. Ultimately, the bulk of this crisis that we're facing is created by North America and is created by Europe. They've modernized, they've developed, they've built modern industrial societies by burning a ton of fossil fuels, by burning a lot of coal, by burning a lot of oil, by burning a lot of gas to create the crisis, and then turn around to other countries and say, well, we did this, but you can't do that. You can't develop, you can't modernize, is the height of moral bankruptcy. Meanwhile, China is the workshop of the world. Like, emissions in the US, emissions in Canada, emissions in Europe have gone down a little bit in the last 30, 40 years. But that's not because we've made big compromises in our lifestyle. It's not because we've made big compromises in trying to generate economic growth or in our development. We haven't made actually huge commitment to renewables in spite of the propaganda around that. What we've done is exported our emissions to China, to India, to Bangladesh, and to other countries of the global south. Household energy consumption in the US and Canada is 8 or 9 times as high as it is in China. So in as much as China is a major emitter, it's not because people are driving around in massive SUVs and living in huge mansions. Actually, hardly anyone does that in China. It's extremely rare, even for wealthy people. People do that here. People do that in the US. China's emissions are not based on luxury and ostentatious wealth. Meanwhile, China's a developing country. China is a country that only a few decades ago was extremely poor, had precious little industry. Over the last few decades, its use of fossil fuels has steadily increased as it's industrialized. And as its use of fossil fuels has gone up, its poverty levels have gone down. There's an inverse relationship between the two things. And, we can hardly blame China for wanting to reduce poverty levels, for wanting to modernize, for wanting to develop. Nonetheless, we've got this narrative in the West that China's a climate criminal, which is, of course, obviously ahistorical. But there's a reason for it. Aside from general new Cold War anti-China propaganda, which of course we've always got lots of time for, it's kind of an excuse for inaction on the part of the West. Look at COP29 at the moment. There's a lot of pressure on China to contribute to climate financing. Like most economists reckon that the global south will need, or the poorer countries will need around $1 trillion a year in climate financing. And the wealthy countries, the European countries, North America, Australia, Japan are saying, well, we're not going to do this unless China joins in as well, because China's a big emitter of greenhouse gases and China's got money. And there's this implication that China should have the same responsibilities as the US, as Europe, and that runs completely counter to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is written into international law. The US, Canada, Britain, Western Europe, Japan, these are the countries that should be blazing a trail to green, sustainable development, and they should be sharing their resources and their findings with other countries. China is still a developing country. It's still on the road to modernization. Its greenhouse gases emissions are directly related to its development, and that's clearly not the case in US and Europe. All that said, China is, of course, making incredible progress in relation to tackling climate change and environmental conservation. This idea of ecological civilization has become very prominent. It's a catchphrase. You hear it everywhere in China these days, and tackling ecological issues and building ecological protection, that those ideas have become integrated into all levels of economic planning and policy making. Erik Solheim, who's a former Norwegian minister and a former UN Undersecretary General and like a big expert on green matters, calls China the indispensable country for everything green. China's announced very ambitious long-term targets to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. It's on track to reach the peak carbon emissions well ahead of schedule. Actually, according to credible analysis, it's already done it. Like 2023 is likely China's peak year of carbon emissions, and they're on the way down now. And if it meets those targets, both of those achievements will have taken less than half the time they took in the West. And, China has a habit of meeting its goals. And since those goals were announced in 2021, they've become deeply entrenched in the planning system. They've become deeply entrenched in economic performance metrics at every level of government. If you look at what China's doing in renewable energy capacity reached about 50% of total generation capacity in China last year. China's responsible for 60% of all renewable energy production and renewable energy investment at the moment. So those are last year's figures. Chinese manufacturers dominate the renewable energy industry, solar panels, all the rest of it. I think they account for about 70% of global production of solar panels. And that's the result of the government setting clear objectives and policy guidelines around that. In the 15 years from 2007 to 2022, coal's share of the power mix was reduced from over 80% to around 50%. It is true that China continues to build new coal-fired power plants, and there's a lot of criticism of it on that basis. But firstly, the number of new coal plants is reducing very rapidly. Secondly, a lot of coal plants are being mothballed because they're no longer useful and necessary. 3, the ones that are being built mainly are to provide like reserve capacity to ensure reliability of supply from solar and wind power plants. And fourthly, the ones that are being built now are very modern, like they're advanced supercritical or ultra supercritical plants. They're much efficient. They're much more efficient. They're much cleaner than the old ones, and they're much more efficient and clean than the ones in the West. And China's innovations and China's investment around renewable energy are having an impact globally. Like that, because of China's investment, global solar photovoltaic costs have gone down by more than 80% in the last decade, and wind generation costs have gone down to 60% in the last decade, to the point where in most of the world, if you're building a power plant now, it's cheaper to do it using renewable methods than using fossil fuels. Via the Belt and Road Initiative, tons of investment is going into renewable energy, and it's providing a lot of countries, especially the global south, the opportunity to leapfrog the whole fossil fuel stage of development, essentially. You've got solar plants being built in Cuba, in South Africa, in Pakistan, in Argentina, in Zimbabwe. There's high-speed rail been rolled out in the last few years in Indonesia, in Laos, in Kenya. In terms of electric transport, China has got like 95% of the world's electric buses can be found in China. As of last year, 77% of all buses in the country are electric, and that's up from 16% in 2016. China's got more high-speed rail miles than the rest of the world combined. It's got 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, which is fully electric. Britain, for the sake of comparison, if you're interested, has 113. Chinese electric cars make up about 60% of worldwide sales. There's loads of progress in relation to protecting biodiversity, in water conservation, development of sponge cities and things of that nature. Really impressive progress around afforestation. The forest coverage level has increased from 12% 4 decades ago to 24%, so it's doubled now. I think it's important to ask why it's China specifically that's making all this progress. You know, China's a developing country. China's a country of the global south. China's a country that until quite recently was very poor. Why isn't it the US that's making all this progress? Why isn't it the EU? Why isn't it Britain? Why isn't it Canada? You know, like the problem of climate change has been very well understood for decades. And, you know, since 91, 92, since the Rio summit, essentially, it's been kind of understood on the basis of a global consensus, and has been written international law what the problem is and the basics of how we solve it. But yet it's China that's essentially implementing a radical Green New Deal. You know, if what the Chinese are doing was being done in Britain and in the US, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and people like that could, you know, take the rest of the decade off. You know, they'd be amazed at this kind of progress that's being made. Why is it China that's putting this massive effort, these huge resources into the project of preventing climate breakdown and protecting the natural environment? It must be related to the class character of the Chinese state. It must be connected to the fact that the capitalist class in China is not the ruling class and doesn't get to decide where resources are invested. It must be connected to the fact that the fossil fuel lobby in China has no meaningful sway over policy. It must be connected to the essentially planned nature of the Chinese economy. You know, even the private sector is very heavily regulated. There's public ownership of the banks, which means that investment decisions, finance decisions, are made, you know, by the government, by state-owned entities. There's public ownership of the energy industry and most of the transport industry, and in general, there's a priority of people over profit. You know, and in spite of the quantity of private capital and the role of the market in the Chinese economy, which is of course very substantial, essentially and overall, it's a system that aims at producing use values over exchange values. And you know, I think that, you know, Richard touched on this idea of degrowth, which is, you know, interesting concept and warrants further discussion. But I think, you know, the idea of priorities like producing use values as opposed to producing exchange values is really the core of that. And I think it's a kind of somewhat clearer way of conceptualizing what we as societies need to do. In summary, you know, what I'm saying is the fact that China is making all this progress around environmental protection as compared to the major advanced capitalist countries is proof of the superiority of socialism over capitalism. Just quickly to finish, I'd like to talk about, you know, some of the dangers of the new Cold War and the growing hostility of Western governments towards China. You know, unfortunately, it turns out Western governments are more interested in containing China than in saving the planet. You know, the West could benefit from China's innovations. The West could benefit from China's investments. But what does it do instead? It imposes tariffs on Chinese solar materials. It imposes tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. It imposes sanctions on Chinese solar materials for spurious reasons. You know, meanwhile, we're facing an urgent situation, an existential crisis that should obviously call for the closest possible cooperation. The US, Europe, China, and others should be collaborating on research, on development for climate change adaptation and mitigation, on renewable energy systems, on advanced intelligence systems like artificial intelligence systems for monitoring weather patterns and so on, providing urgently needed support to the least developing countries and so on. China's been abundantly clear that what it wants is a close collaborative relationship with the other major powers around environmental issues. So, I think those of us that are in the West, and who care about these matters, we should be demanding that our governments stop shirking their responsibilities, build mutual trust with China, cooperate with China, and do everything possible to keep Earth habitable for humanity. Chen Weihua, who's a Chinese journalist based in Brussels, he works for China Daily, that is quite well known on social media. I'm sure lots of you are familiar with him. He commented today in an article that climate change, not China, is the biggest threat to US and the world. In the age of Trump, it's like all the more important that environmentalists and progressives support China's leadership on this matter and pressure their governments to coordinate with China. Trump will almost certainly withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement again, maybe even from the UN Climate Convention. He's going to be handing out drilling licenses like confetti. He'll be getting big support from the fossil fuel lobby, and he'll be giving big support to the fossil fuel industry. He certainly won't be supporting renewables. He will be imposing more sanctions on China, more tariffs on Chinese EVs and solar materials. And we should be careful as the left, as the communist movement, the socialist movement, the progressive movement, the peace movement, the environmental movement, that we don't allow ourselves to be used as a pawn in this new Cold War. Thank you.